There it is. Okay, I think we're ready.
Yes.
Okay, we're going to get into the first 3 chapters of Leviticus, and these 3 chapters are what we call the free will offerings, and they're different from the sin offerings and some of the other offerings that we'll talk about in the next few chapters. But I started this lesson with a phrase that is repeated throughout these 3 chapters, and it refers to each of the 3 types of offerings we're going to talk about. It is a burnt, grain, and fellowship offering, an offering made by fire, and an aroma pleasing to the Lord. That phrase, aroma pleasing to the Lord, is something that is repeated over and over again during these chapters. Last week, when we introduced the book of Leviticus, we talked about what God's twofold purpose with the Israelites was. And he wanted his people to be a holy people so that they could be in a close relationship with him as a holy God. But he also wanted his holy people to be representative of God's holiness and God's goodness throughout the whole world. So it was a relationship with Israel, who in turn would be a illustration or an example to the rest of the world. Now, in order for a holy God to have a relationship with man, there had to be something done about man's sinful nature. And we're going to be talking about man's sinful nature tonight as a general term of fallen man, starting with the first Adam, who committed the first sin that put us in a position of being a sinful people that was created by a holy God. And in order for God to maintain his relationship with Israel as his treasured possession, he had to come up with rituals, procedures, and means by which his people would recognize their sinful nature and lay their sin before God's throne at the altar of fire and perpetuate or to do something that would gain God's favor. And when God's favor in atonement is, as we studied in the past, it's accomplished by a blood sacrifice, a sacrifice of a living existence, an animal. God could very well have dealt with sin by just wiping out mankind, taking the life of mankind for their sin. But God, in his grace and in his holiness, decided that he would accept a substitute for the life that he could otherwise rightly take for the sin and the rejection of God by mankind. Now, we talked last week also about the 2 aspects of atonement. The first aspect being one of ransom, or paying the price. The price is paid by the sacrifice of a life. It's very costly. And we also talk about the purification from sin. Sin defiles mankind. It defiles us. And that defilement separates us from God. So atonement deals with 2 aspects, ransom and purification. So this week we're going to learn that the offerings which the Israelites presented in voluntarily, free will, they are able to draw close to God. Now, how do you draw close if you're an Israelite? Well, God's presence is in the tabernacle, specifically in the Holy of Holies on his throne, which is the Ark of the Covenant and the mercy seat. And only the high priest, once a year on the Day of Atonement, could approach God in the most holy place, the Holy of Holies. Throughout the year, twice a day, the priest would go into the holy place, the second part of the tabernacle, and they would keep the candle going, or the light going. They would basically celebrate on Sunday, eating the showbread, and they would perform the ritual of going to the altar, lighting the incense, which is lifting up the petitions and prayers of the people. That was done by the priests on a rotating basis daily. But then you had outside the tent of the tabernacle, you had the courtyard. And in the courtyard, you had the brazen altar, which was used to basically burn the sacrifices offered by the priests daily and by the people in their free will offerings, which we're going to focus on that. So in order to approach God, you had to, if you're an Israelite, you had to come from where you were encamped, and you have to go and enter into the courtyard through the east gate, the east entrance. And as soon as you come in, you're looking at the brazen altar, and behind it to the left, as you're looking at it, would be the laver, which was used to clean and wash everything. And so you just didn't get a chance to walk in there and say, I'm Joe Israelite, and I just want to see God today. They didn't say, well, do you have an appointment? You would go there with a sacrifice. And that sacrifice would be the means by which you could approach God closer. Now, the lay Israelite, as far as he would get, would be to the brazen altar. But for most lay Israelites, that's as far as they wanted to go. And at that point, when they made their sacrifice, then it was presented by the priests in one form or another to God. And so we're going to talk about this first step with these three, what we call free will offerings that were made so the layperson, the ordinary Israelite, could approach God in the tent of the meeting. Now, when we talk about sacrifice, we're talking about a blood sacrifice. We're talking about a living animal that God specifies that must be slaughtered with the blood sprinkled on the brazen altar, and the animal, all of it or a portion of it, burned on the altar as an aroma pleasing to God. The message that I want to get to deliver tonight, the main message is that the free will offerings provided a means for the ordinary man to come before God without facing God's wrath and judgment, so that he could enter into and enjoy a covenant relationship with God, foreshadowing what Jesus accomplished in his earthly ministry and his sacrifice on the cross, so that we can come before God without facing God's wrath against sin and enjoy eternal peace with God. That's a mouthful, but we take it for granted as Christians that we can go before God directly. The veil has been torn, but these free will offerings were a foreshadowing, and they really represented how the ordinary person in faith can approach God at the tent of the meeting. So we're going to talk a little bit about an overview and general information about these three different types of free will offerings. And then we'll get into the three of them: the burnt offering of flesh, the grain offering, the peace offering. And then we'll have discussion questions and then reach the conclusions and applications. Well, let's talk about these free will offerings. The free will means that there's no law that requires the ordinary person to come to the tent of the meeting and make a sacrifice to God. In other words, these free will offerings are not dictated by a sin that this man committed, or a grievance, or an act that he did either knowingly or unknowingly to harm or hurt another Israelite. These were offerings that were made in a general sense. I could have called this a general purpose offering, if you will, because these are offerings that were made to draw close to God. And so they can be presented by any man. They were not, the priest assisted in the offering, but these people that would come to the tent of the meeting with their sacrifice would come, and there's a real dispute among the scholars whether they, when they came into the tent of the meeting, they were the ones that actually killed or sacrificed the animal, and were they the ones that cut the animal up or butchered it? And were they the ones that skinned it? There's a divided opinion on whether the priests, who were really trained butchers for this purpose, that did this, or whether the person himself. Now, we live in a society today where most of us have hardly ever see a pig, let alone slaughter a pig. But if you have ever lived on a farm and you grew pigs like I did back in Missouri, slaughtering a pig is a very common practice. And it wasn't very easy to do. Butchering a pig or a lamb or a cow, that took some training and experience. I just was getting old enough where I could start doing that. But this is common man who brought his sacrifice to the tent of the meeting. They're used to slaughtering animals for food, but they also, the priesthood was trained to go ahead and do this. Now, again, these offerings were made without any specific reference to a law or a regulation which the man violated. It was no infraction on the part of the person making the sacrifice. It was a sacrifice made so he could approach God. Now, it still is a sacrifice that deals with atonement. Atonement is a way of appeasing God or perpetuating God's wrath so that if you approach him, God is not going to punish you or judge you for your sin, but he's going to accept your perpetuatory offer of sacrifice and listen to what your petition is or receive your worship and praise. So it's really it's a way of atonement to facilitate access to God. It would be the Israelite pay to play type of act, which you're hearing in the news so much. The sacrifice so he could have communion with God. This is because we have a sinful nature that we have to make sacrifice to approach God. Now, this burning of the sacrifice, the offering created by the fire, was a fire of judgment, but it created an aroma pleasing to God. In other words, if the person that brought his sacrifice to the tent of the meeting brought the right sacrifice in the right manner with the right faith and heart, then the sacrifice would be accepted and the person making the offer would be accepted by the sacrifice he made. In other words, God accepts the offer. Now, ultimately, we'll learn that the one sacrifice that was the most pleasing aroma to God, that God was blessed by and pleased with, was Jesus Christ. And these are a foreshadowing of that. So there are three types of free will offerings. We're going to talk about the burnt offering of the flesh, which is the first chapter of Leviticus. It's also referred to as the Olah, or interestingly enough, Holocaust. Then the burnt offering is also can be translated, Olah can be transferred as the whole burnt offering, representing the whole animal that's burnt on the altar. It required the entire flesh of the animal to be consumed on the altar. The entire animal except the skin and the blood was drained from the animal, and then some translations say sprinkled on all four sides of the altar. The real Hebrew translation is splashed. They took that blood and they splashed it on the altar. Plenty of blood. It was, if you had a weak stomach, it would be a little tough for you to participate in. Then the second offering, the grain offering, is in chapter 2 of Leviticus, and it's also referred to as a mincha, or meal offering. The grain offering was divided into two portions. The remembrance portion, which was burned on the altar, and the priest's portion, which was given to the priest. So the grain offering is not an offering of a sacrifice of life of an animal or the blood of the animal. It is not an atonement offering. It's a grain offering. It's a meal offering. And so a portion of the grain offering was put on the altar and burned, and the other portion was given to the priest as food. It usually, because the grain offering was not an atonement offering, that the person making the offer was approaching God, the grain offering also associated with either the burnt offering or what we call the peace offering, which is the third kind of offering. So it accompanied an atonement offering that was made. Now the peace offering, it's another sacrifice of an animal, but it didn't have to be a male animal. It could be a female or male animal, still had to be unblemished. And it was divided into two portions. The peace offering was divided into the fatty part, or the organs, internal organs with fat around them. Those were considered by the Israelites as the best part, filet mignon, if you will, of the flesh. Meat was rare. They didn't like to kill their animals because it would reduce the population of animals, but God was given the best part of the best animal, and that's the fatty part. And that part, the fatty part, was an internal organs. That was the part that was placed on the altar and burned up. Now, in the peace offering or the fellowship offering, the other remaining portions were divided between the priest, Aaron and his sons, and the person making the offer. So it was really divided three different ways: a portion for God, a portion for the priest, and a portion for the one making the offer. And they had basically a meal in the presence of God. It kind of reminds you of when Moses, after the 10 Commandments were given, Moses and the 70 elders went up on Mount Sinai and they sat down and had a meal with God. And so that's kind of what the fellowship offering is all about. It's a well-being offering. It's a nourishment offering. It represents not only physical nourishment, a meal offering, a flesh offering of meat, but it also is an offering that is nourished by the Lord's presence. And so if you have the fellowship offering in conjunction with the grain offering, you have bread and meat in the fellowship offering. So let's go and now focus specifically on the burnt offering of an animal. This is the first chapter of Leviticus, and the procedure for making the burnt offering is stated in verses 2 through 9 of Leviticus chapter 1. The Lord called to Moses and spoke to him from the tent of the meeting. He said, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, when any of you brings an offering to the Lord, bring as your offering an animal from either the herd, that's cows, or the flock, that's sheep or goats. If the offering is a burnt offering from the herd," in other words, we're talking about now if the person making the offer is making a burnt offering, an offering to approach God, it's not because of sin. He's going to tell the priest, here is my steer, or here's my goat, or here's my sheep, and I'm making a burnt offering. Well, the priest knows that he's not going to confess a sin. He's not done an infraction to another Israelite. He's there to approach God and make a request. And so the offering is a burnt offering from the herd. He is to offer a male without defect. He must present it at the entrance of the tent of the meeting so that it will be acceptable to the Lord. He is to lay his hand on the head of the burnt offering, and it will be accepted on his behalf, make atonement for him. Note the substitution. The animal is sacrificed for the person, the offerer. He is to slaughter the young bull before the Lord, and then Aaron's sons, the priest, shall bring the blood and sprinkle it. Some translations splash it on against the altar on all sides at the entrance to the tent of the meeting. He is to skin the burnt offering and cut it into pieces. The sons of Aaron and the priests are to put fire on the altar and arrange the wood on the fire. Then Aaron's sons, the priests, arrange the pieces, including the head and the fat, on the burnt wood that is on the altar. He is to wash the inner parts, the legs, with water, and the priest is to burn all of it on the altar. It is a burnt offering, an offering made by fire, and aroma pleasing to the Lord. This is an offering of the entire animal. The fatty portion, all the flesh. The only thing that is not really offered is the blood. That's sprinkled on the altar, and the excess blood is drained, and the skins, which were used for other purposes. It required the bringing of an unblemished male. What's that foretell? Our Christ as an unblemished lamb sacrificed for our atonement of sins. Now, this animal could be taken from the herd, a bull or a steer, or from the flock, which would be sheep or goats, or two different type of birds. A bird animal offering was allowed. And we're going to talk about why these different levels of offerings. The bird had to be either a dove, which was a turtle dove, or a pigeon, which is part of a dove is part of the pigeon family. Now, what we would do is you would approach the east entrance to the tent of the meeting with your cow, goat, or sheep, or with your birds, and you would enter the tent of the meeting to the courtyard, and the priest would approach you. They would inspect the animal to make sure it was unblemished, that it was a male, and that it was of suitable age. And once the priest would say that this animal is an acceptable offering, then you would say to the priest, I am making a burnt offering. Now, if you brought doves, that would pretty well signify you're making a burnt offering. But the point is that you would tell the priest what kind of offering you're making. Then what would happen is the animal would be slaughtered. Because it says he without a reference to who the antecedent of he is, we really don't know from historical records whether it was the individual making the offer that slaughtered the animal or the priest. But you'd think, because most of the priests were very qualified at butchering and they'd know how to and where to take the animal, they usually took it to the north side of the altar, because then they could slaughter it, drain the blood, and then skin it, and then could take anything that was refuge and pile it with the ashes, because it's right at the tent of the meeting where they could take it out of the courtyard and dispose of it. Now, the offerer wanted the Lord to accept his offering, and by accepting it, he wanted to gain God's favor and avoids God's punishment. In other words, it was offered in atonement. And it was by accepting what the sacrifice would be, then God would be accepting the offer and his sin. And so often these type of approach with the tent of the meeting and making the sacrifice were joined with some sort of petition, praying for prosperity, praying for health, the same type of prayers we lift up to God all the time. Now, before the animal was slaughtered, the offerer, the person that's bringing the sacrifice, he would lay his hand on the head of the animal. They call this actual hand leaning. It wasn't just putting the hand or tapping the head, it was leaning, putting pressure on the head of the animal. And let's see, I need to get rid of this real quick. Okay. Anyway, this hand leaning ceremony or rite, the significance was to establish a relationship between the offerer, the person making the sacrifice, and the animal itself that was going to be sacrificed. A lot of us say he was transferring the sin of the offerer to the animal to be sacrificed. But really what is to get a relationship between the two that would be passed on with establishing the relationship between God and the offerer. So the sacrifice would then be credited to the offerer. Now, the sacrifice of the animal replaced or substitute for the sacrifice of the offerer. Now, this, at the time that he did this ritual of leaning his hand on the head animal, that's when he stated the purpose of the sacrifice. The animal was slaughtered, the blood collected and splattered on the altar on all four sides. The animal was skinned, the inner parts washed to get rid of any fecal matter. Anytime you've ever cleaned a fish or an animal, you always have to get the fecal matter out, because contamination for any part of the animal could not be placed on the altar of sacrifice. It had to be unblemished and undefected animal that was sacrificed. And the entire animal was placed on the altar in pieces in a certain way, and it was burned or consumed by the fire. Now, I mentioned 3 different types of animals that were used for the burnt offering. An unblemished male bull or steer taken from the herd. This was the most expensive and most valuable of the offerings. Usually the richer members of the Israelite community would present a steer offering as an offering acceptable to God. In the middle class, those that basically did not have cattle, their offering could be either a sheep or a goat. Leviticus 10 through 13 describes the sheep or goat offering, and it was taken from the flock. If the offering is a burnt offering from the flock, from either the sheep or the goats, he is to offer a male without defect. He is to slaughter it at the north side of the altar before the Lord, and Aaron's sons, the priests, shall sprinkle its blood against the altar on all sides. He is to cut it into pieces, and the priest shall arrange them, including the head and the fat, on the burning wood that is on the altar. He is to wash the inner parts and legs with water, and the priest is to bring all of it and burn on the altar. It is a burnt offering, an offering made by fire, an aroma pleasing to the Lord. Okay, again, it's even though it's less costly, it's a sheep or a goat, it has to be unblemished, male, and it had to be pure, clean from fecal matter, and the entire animal was burnt as a sacrifice on the altar. Now that was for the middle class. For the poor class, those members of the Israelite community that didn't have cattle or flocks, sheep or goats, they could offer a pigeon or a dove. And each of these animals would be relatively available in the area in the wilderness. In fact, if you go down to San Francisco, you can see pigeons everywhere. So, they're pretty readily available. The procedure for a bird was a little bit different because it is a bird. In Leviticus 14 through 17, it says, if the offering to the Lord is a burnt offering of birds, he is to offer a dove or a young pigeon. The priest shall bring it to the altar, wring off the head, and burn it on the altar. Its blood shall be drained on the side of the altar. He is to remove the crop, that's the part up here, and its contents for the pebbles to digest food, and throw it to the east side of the altar, where the ashes are. He shall tear it open by the wings, not severing it completely, and then the priest shall burn it on the wood that is on the fire of the altar. It is a burnt offering, an offering made by fire, an aroma pleasing to the Lord. What we have is, in God's grace and mercy, he accepts offerings at different costs to the offerer. Now, if a very wealthy person with lots of cattle offered a pigeon or a dove, that would not be an acceptable offering. If you remember in the New Testament in Acts, remember when they offered only part of the proceeds from the sale of their home and then God destroyed them? They were people that were making what would be equivalent to a burnt offering to God in terms of their gift to the church, and they're holding back. God requires in a burnt offering, an offering to approach God, an offering that is the whole animal, and a costly offering based upon the means of the person making the offer. There really isn't any explanation as to why a pigeon or a turtle dove. Some scholars speculate that it might be because both of those types are pretty faithful to their family members. They don't run around with other turtle doves or other pigeons. They kind of keep a family unit. And so they emphasize, but that puts too much, in my mind, that puts too much emphasis on the sacrifice instead of the heart of the offeror. The offeror, God prescribes what's to be offered. It's the heart of the offerer in faith that comes the offer to the Lord. Let's talk about these type of animals producing an aroma pleasing to the Lord. This is an atonement offering. It's an offering on the fire of judgment. It's an offering of sacrifice, blood and the flesh of the animal in perpetuation for sin, in atonement for sin. In other words, to take away God's wrath or punishment for sin and to gain God's favor to accept the sinner in his presence. It's a ransom purification sacrifice. It's foreshadowing the death and sacrifice of Jesus on the cross. He's the ultimate atonement for mankind. The atonement by Jesus Christ fulfilled both the ransom of the sinner, paying the price for God's not judging us for our sin, and purifying the sinner from his defilement that was created by the sin. So that's burnt offering. It really represents and typifies Jesus Christ as the ultimate offering made to God. Now we're going to talk about the grain offering. That's the second chapter of Leviticus, verses 1 through 16. And 1 through 3, we talk about what the grain offering is generally. When someone brings a grain offering to the Lord, his offering is to be of fine flour. He is to pour oil on it, put incense on it, and take it to Aaron's sons, the priests. The priest will take a handful of the fine flour and oil together with all the incense and burn this as a memorial portion on the altar, an offering made by fire, an aroma pleasing to the Lord. The rest of the grain offering belongs to Aaron and his sons. It is a most holy part of the offerings made to the Lord by fire. So what we have here is a description of the contents of the grain offering and the two parts of the grain offering. Now, as I mentioned before, the grain offering normally accompanied the burnt offering or the fellowship offering that we'll just talk about in a few minutes. The Israelites always thought that the sacrifices that they're making to the Lord were treated as meals. It was like when they had the most important guest at their tent. Remember when the angels visited Abraham? He had a meal with him and he told Sarah, go and cook bread. And so they slaughtered an animal and they cooked bread because they had important guests, and they gave them the best of the meat and they gave them the best of the grain or the bread offerings. And so this is how you honor their guests, and it was carried forward in the grain offering to our Lord when you approached the Lord in the tent of the meeting. The various forms by which the grain offering was presented. It was either uncooked in finely milled or ground flour, or bread baked or roasted in three specific ways. The grain offerings consisted really of four components: the fine milled flour, which was either wheat or barley. It was presented raw, baked, or roasted. The other component was olive oil. The other component was salt. And the final component that was part of the offering, but not included in the whole part of the offering, was the incense or frankincense. Frankincense is not edible, so you really separated it from the bread offering. But frankincense was on the portion of the grain offering that was burnt on the altar. Incense lifting up to God, a pleasant aroma. And so what we had here is the grain offering was divided into two portions. The memorial portion, which was the smaller portion with the frankincense that was burned on the altar of fire and making that aroma that was pleasing to the Lord. And the priest portion, which is the rest of it, which was given to Aaron and Aaron's sons as food. Leviticus 2, verses 8 through 10 describe this. Bring the grain offering made of these things to the Lord, present it to the priest, who shall take it to the altar. He shall take out the memorial proportion from the grain offering and burn it on the altar as an offering made by fire and aroma pleasing to the Lord. The rest of the grain offering belongs to Aaron and his sons. It is a most holy of the offerings made to the Lord by fire. So what we have here is, because the grain offer did not include a blood sacrifice, it's not a sacrifice in atonement. It's part of the meal offering, the fellowship, the companionship with the Lord. Uh, um, the offerer would take the grain offering to the priest, and then he would take it to the front of the altar. He would take a handful of either the uncooked flour or the crumbled grains of bread or a chunk of the bread. He'd take a portion of it and it'd be covered with oil, and he would put the frankincense on it and put it on the altar as a memorial or remembrance. The person making the grain offering wanted God to remember the grain offering and be favorable in granting the offerer's requests. And the main request was for God to be present with the offer, for God to receive the offering favorably. So it was a remembrance to the Lord, a fragrance, as if the Lord needed to be reminded. But the point is that the purpose of it was a remembrance, that they're saying to God, and remember me and my prayers and my requests, and bring to me your presence, your fellowship. The Jews like to say, may your face shine upon me. So this is the idea of the whole thing. Um, the oil that was extracted from the olive oil, and it represented really the Holy Spirit with the bread. Jesus was the bread of life. Jesus also had the Spirit descend as a dove, and the Spirit aided and helped Jesus after he tested in the wilderness. What we have is a foreshadowing of Jesus as the bread of life and the impact of the Holy Spirit in Jesus' lifetime ministry. The salt represented the covenant that God had made with the Israelites. And many times in the Jewish literature, you'll see the salt of the covenant. What we're talking about, this covenant that God made with the 10 commandments for Israel to obey God's commands and be blessed. And if Israel disobeyed God's commands, they would not receive God's blessing. And so the salt was there to remind them of their covenant relationship with God. It also was to remind them that they were to set an example to the world. They were to be the salt to the other nations. And what do we say in the New Testament? We're the salt to the unbeliever. We're the salt to the world. So when we talk about this, we see a foreshadowing and how the New Testament refers to this. Now, the methods of presenting the grain offering, basically the methods of either presenting it raw or cooked. As I said, when it's presented raw or uncooked, it's finely ground, very fine flour mixed with olive oil and salt, and the frankincense placed on the side. Now, when it was cooked, it was either baked or roasted in loaves or roasted in cakes. If cooked, the grain offerings were prepared in 3 different ways. The first way, it was prepared in ovens or loaves of bread, much like we prepare bread today. It was unleavened bread. It didn't have leaven to rise because leaven represented sin. And anything offered on the altar of fire could not be corrupted by sin. It had to be pure, a pure offering. So one that was baked, then it was brushed with olive oil on the top and burned at the top. It was considered the choicest of the grain offerings. In Leviticus 2:4, it describes this baked or oven offering. If you bring a grain offering baked in an oven, it is to consist of fine flour, cakes made without yeast and mixed with oil, or wafers, smaller cakes, made without yeast and spread with oil. And so I imagine, even though it wasn't yeast, it was still bread that was very fragrant and very nourishing. Well, the alternate way of presenting a bread offering or a grain offering was on an iron griddle or a flat iron. I always like to go camping because I have that solid cast iron pan that I cook things on, and it heats evenly. Well, griddle cakes were hard and thin and were crumbled. So once they were baked or cooked on the griddle, they're crumbled up into crumbs. And that's before they were presented to the priest. After crumbling the griddle cakes, the offerer would pour olive oil over the crumbs and then hand the breadcrumbs to the priest in some sort of container. The Leviticus 2 verses 5 and 6 describes this. If your grain offering is prepared on a griddle, it is to be made of fine flour mixed with oil and without yeast. Crumble it and pour oil on it. It is a grain offering. Okay, the final way is the way that we make pancakes. The pans were used to prepare the cakes, and they're similar to what we use as a covered frying pan. The flour was cooked with olive oil in it, and this made it very sweet. It also helped it rise. These offerings were not hard, but softer and thicker than the cakes made on the griddle. Leviticus 2:7 describes this. If your grain offering is cooked in a pan, it is to be made of fine flour and oil. Now, I mentioned that the grain offerings could not contain yeast, nor could they contain honey. Honey was a way of accelerating the effects of yeast, and also was a way of using artificial sweeteners, if you will. A grain offering had to be pure from the bread. Jesus was the bread of life, the pure bread of life. Leviticus 2:11 says, "Every grain offering you bring to the Lord must be made without yeast, for you are not to burn any yeast or honey in an offering made to the Lord by fire." Now, it's a little bit more difficult to draw out the significance of these different type of grain offerings. But many scholars, and I'm surprised how many there are, have suggested, including Origen, who was one of the first to have a homilies on the book of Leviticus. It says that these different types of grain offerings represented the different stages in Jesus's ministry. The loaf, or the pure bread without yeast, represented Jesus when he first came on earth. Jesus as an infant was pure and holy without any contamination of yeast. And so the bread offering signifies that time before his ministry started, where his holiness and purity reflected in the loaf of bread. The cakes on the iron griddle represent the next stage of Jesus' ministry, when he ministered to the Israelites. And boy, the crumbling represents how he was rejected, how he was mistreated, how he was abused and tempted, and how people didn't accept him for what he was. And so it really, some scholars reflect that that's the representation of Jesus during this portion of the ministry. The cakes made in the fry pan signified Jesus when he is placed in trial before Pilate, and ultimately when he is crucified on the cross. I tried to get a little bit more information as to why they drew these conclusions from the different types of cakes, but I present it to you because many scholars do make this relationship. Um, I find it a little bit difficult to see how it relates to each one, but I accept the scholarship that preceded my scholarship on the book of Leviticus and present it to you because it is part of the literature. Okay, now we're going to get to the final peace offering, and this is the fellowship offering. Without going through reading these long passages, we're basically talking about this being a fellowship offering. And as I mentioned before, this fellowship offering can be a male or female animal, either a steer or bull, male or female. Well, a steer or bull would be a male, or a female, a heifer, or it could be a female goat or a female sheep. If it was a female sheep, it had to be one with a wide tail, because the wide tail sheeps have more fat, and that was a portion that was burned on the altar. Again, these offerings had to be without any blemish or defect. And again, the offerer would lean his hand on the head of the animal, be sacrificed, and indicate to the priest that this is a fellowship offering, not a burnt offering. That would tell the priest that the whole animal isn't going to be consumed on the altar, only a portion of the animal. And what portion was that? It'd be the best parts, the fatty parts, the internal organs, because those were considered at the time in the culture as being the best part, or the filet mignon of the animal. The inner parts, again, were cleaned and consumed on the altar as a fellowship offering. The rest of the animal was then cut into pieces, and it was then shared in a meal offering. It's likely that this portion was partially cooked, but it was divided between parties and later taken as a meal offering. But the priests and the offerer shared in the remaining parts of the animal, the remaining flesh. And like the other offerings that were in atonement to approach God, the blood of the animal was spread on all four sides of the altar. The type of offering here, a fellowship offering, it involved all three parties. God with the part that was burned entirely on the altar, the other parts that were shared between the offerer and the priest. So you have three parties, all three, God, the priest as the intermediary, and the offerer, all in fellowship in this kind of fellowship or meal offering. They call it a peace offering because it's very rare that you ever have a meal with your enemies. I can only think of sometimes in the book of Esther where Esther had two meals with her enemy Haman. But in most cases, a peace offering is made because you're in fellowship and in harmony with the person that you're having the meal with. And this is what the meal offering or the fellowship offering represented. Usually it was also accompanied by the grain offering. So the fellowship offerings were made for atonement, followed by reconciliation and peace with God. As I mentioned before, the fat and internal organs that were burnt entirely on the altar were considered the best part of the offering, and the sharing of the other remaining part. When we talk about this being representing the final of the voluntary or the free will offerings, I always like to think of this offering being that day when we will be with the Lord at that banquet. And that banquet with the Lord dining with us, and we'll be in the Lord's presence and we'll be at peace and fully reconciled to the Lord. Okay, so those are the three free will or offerings that the first three chapters of Leviticus discusses. Now we're going to go or your thoughts regarding the question, and do so by raising your hands. The free will offer provided the opportunity for all men to offer an acceptable sacrifice to atone for man's sin so that they can enjoy their covenant relationship with God. Each of the free will sacrifice set apart all or a portion of the offering to be burned on the altar of fire, which is God's judgment against sin, and were accepted by God as an aroma pleasing to the Lord. The free will offer substituted the animal's blood and life to take the place of the offerer of the sacrifice, foreshadowing Jesus' substitutionary sacrifice in atonement for our sin. Jesus offered himself as a single free will offering, bearing on our behalf God's judgment against sin in atonement so that we can come before God in eternal fellowship and peace. So I think we've studied about as much as we can of these first three types of offerings, and we're going to spend more time going through the sin offerings and the other offerings, including the priest offerings, the burnt offerings, and we will distinguish them as we go along. But at least as a category, we walk away with a very good concept of what these type of offerings were and how they were practiced.
Good.
Hey, Bob.